Before we dive into today's episode, I have a request for all of you. We have put our heart and soul into creating quality historical educational content for over 2 years now, and we would love to have you join us as patrons. If you can support us, we promise to bring even more fascinating stories from history. So let's get started. Back in Mecca, life wasn't easy for the Meccans. Frequent tribal raids made trade risky. The arrival of Abraha, an ambitious Ethiopian ruler, was like a big storm on the horizon. He wanted to destroy the Kaaba and build his own shrine at its location. A small band of Meccans, led by Abu Sufyan, set out to intercept Abraha. They planned to block his path near a place called Uhud. Abu Sufyan chose Uhud because it had a narrow passageway surrounded by tall trees. His idea was to hide some archers among the trees and let them loose when the time was right. It was a clever plan, but the Meccans lacked discipline. The archers got excited, couldn't wait for their moment, and fired early. This ruined the element of surprise and gave Abra's army enough time to regroup. They fought bravely, but in the end, the disciplined Abyssinian army defeated them. Not only did they fail to stop Abra, but also lost their own lives. The Meccans who fled told the story of the brave but futile resistance. Now, many years later, when Muhammad heard about the Battle of Uhud, he saw an opportunity. He knew the Meccans needed allies, and he offered a truce. To everyone's surprise, including his own followers, Muhammad decided to personally lead an army to Mecca. This mission was extremely dangerous. Mecca was strongly fortified, guarded by fierce warriors. Also, Muhammad had never commanded a large force in battle before. Despite these challenges, he accepted the responsibility. He chose 40 of his closest companions, promising them God's protection. Their journey took them across rough terrains, scorching heat, and dwindling water supplies. They hid during the day to avoid detection and marched at night. On reaching the designated spot near Mecca, they camped. When Abu Sufyan arrived with reinforcements, Muhammad used his military skills and positioned his troops strategically. They attacked the main gate, distracting the Meccans. Meanwhile, a group scaled the wall and opened another gate. With the city divided, Muhammad entered Mecca with his companions. It was a stunning victory, one that could have ended the conflict between Mecca and Medina. But there was a twist. Muhammad didn't punish the Meccans, even those who had opposed him fiercely. Instead, he showed mercy, accepting the surrender of Mecca without any resistance. This magnanimous gesture shocked the Arab world. His followers wondered why he didn't take revenge. Some thought he was being indecisive. Others worried that the Meccans might betray them. But Muhammad's actions had a deeper purpose. He wanted to make peace with Mecca, not just for the sake of his community, but for all of humanity. He declared the entire Arabian Peninsula as a sacred land, haram, off limits to warfare. He proclaimed that shedding blood on that soil was a sin, and he abolished tribal affiliations, replacing them with brotherhood in Islam. With the exception of one individual, Amr ibn Luay, who continued to harbor resentment, the Meccans accepted Islam in large numbers. Among them were prominent figures like Abu Bakr, who played a pivotal role in spreading Islam in the early days. This significant event marked a turning point in history. It transformed Muhammad from a persecuted prophet into the leader of a major religion. And Mecca, once the center of polytheistic worship, became the focal point of the Muslim world. The importance of this transformation cannot be overstated. It laid the foundation for the future expansion of Islam, influencing the lives of billions of people across the globe. Now let's fast forward a bit to the year 638. After conquering most of the Arabian Peninsula, the Muslims looked towards expanding their territory. Next target was Syria, then ruled by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. The Muslims, under the leadership of General Amr ibn al-As, marched into Syria and began conquering city after city. By 644, Jerusalem had fallen, and the Byzantines were pushed to the banks of the river Yarmouk. Now, around this time, the Sasanian Persians had also taken notice of the rising Muslim power. They tried to take advantage of the Byzantine-Muslim War and gain some land for themselves. Seeing the threat, the Muslims, led by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, formed a coalition with the Byzantines and marched towards the Persians. This alliance may sound weird, considering the deep religious divide between Christians and Muslims. But it was based on a simple strategy: fight the bigger threat together and settle scores later. The year is 649 AD, and the sun beats down on the arid plains near the river Yarmouk in Syria. Two mighty armies are poised to clash, each representing a rising power hungry for dominance. The Sasanian Persians, known for their fierce cavalry and tactical prowess, stand ready to face the rapidly expanding Muslim forces. Leading the Persians is Yazdegerd III, the last great Sasanian king, determined to halt the Muslim advance into his empire. On the other side, the Muslim commander, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, a devout believer and shrewd strategist, seeks to continue his faith's astonishing expansion. As the armies prepare to collide, the stage is set for a clash that will have profound implications for the course of history. The resulting battle would be known as the Battle of the River Yarmouk. It's considered a pivotal moment in medieval military history, due to its sheer scale and impact on the political landscape of the time. As the two armies faced off, the Sassanid Persians, known for their formidable cavalry, launched repeated attacks, trying to break through the Muslim lines. Yet despite their ferocity, they failed to gain a decisive advantage. The Muslim infantry held firm, repelling each assault. But it was the vast numbers of the Persian army that posed the greatest challenge. Even though the Muslims fought valiantly, they too began to tire. The prolonged struggle took a toll on both sides. But it was the Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, who first faltered. Desperate to turn the tide, he sent a delegation to Abu Ubaidah with a proposal. He offered peace talks, suggesting an end to hostilities between the two empires. The Muslim commander, ever mindful of his faith's mission, responded with a counter-proposal. Abu Ubaidah, while open to negotiations, also had strategic goals in mind. He proposed a smaller and advantageous region for the Sasanians, essentially seeking to limit their territorial control. Now, here's where the situation takes an unexpected twist. Just when it seemed like the two sides might reach an agreement, Yazdegerd III went back on his word. He broke off the talks abruptly, signaling his army to resume the attack with renewed vigor. The Sasanian emperor's decision to reject the peace offer caught Abu Ubaidah and his Muslim forces off guard. This sudden shift in tactics demonstrated Yazdegerd's desperation, pushing him to take extreme measures to save his kingdom. Faced with this new development, Abu Ubaidah had to regroup and refocus his strategy. He rallied his troops, reminding them of their religious duty and the need to defend against the Sasanian aggression. The Muslim soldiers, deeply committed to their faith, drew strength from these words and prepared to stand firm against the renewed Persian onslaught. Meanwhile, Amr ibn Alas, the Muslim general, took charge of the rear, focusing on securing their camp and supplies. He understood the importance of a stable base in waging war. The Sassanid Persians, rejuvenated by their king's renewed determination, pressed their attack with even greater intensity. They charged forward, hoping to break through the Muslim lines and achieve a decisive victory. But to their dismay, the Muslims stood strong, resisting each wave of attack with unwavering determination. The battle continued for several days, becoming one of the longest and most intense conflicts of the era. Both armies displayed remarkable tenacity, refusing to yield despite the mounting casualties. Then came a critical moment that would change the fate of the battle. A contingent of elite Muslim cavalry, led by skilled horsemen, charged into the heart of the Sasanian army. Their swift and powerful assault disrupted the Persian ranks, creating openings for the rest of the Muslim forces to exploit. Seizing this opportunity, the Muslims launched a coordinated attack, driving the Persians back. With their lines broken, the Sasanian army began to retreat. The Muslims, sensing victory, pursued the retreating Persians, inflicting heavy losses along the way. Yazdegerd III, witnessing his army's collapse, fled the battlefield, hoping to escape to safety. But he was soon captured and brutally executed by the Muslims, marking the end of the Sasanian Empire. In the aftermath of the battle, Abu Ubaidah fulfilled his earlier offer, granting peace and establishing borders that favored the Sasanians. The Muslim victory at the Battle of Yarmouk had far-reaching consequences, halted the Sasanian threat to the newly expanding Muslim state, and secured the Muslim conquest of Syria. This victory also played a pivotal role in the rapid spread of Islam, showcasing the strength and resilience of the Muslim armies. The legacy of the Battle of Yarmouk continued to shape the course of history, influencing the dynamics of power in the medieval world, and thus ends today's episode. What a clash of titans it was. The devout Muslims versus the mighty Persians. Who do you think fought better? Tell us in the comments below. And hey, don't forget to show your support. We've got lots of history to cover, and your support helps us keep going. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Our next story is about strategy versus brute force. Sometimes brains can be a better weapon than brawn. Let me tell you a story from the early days of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad and his followers were driven out of Mecca by a powerful tribe called the Quraysh. So Muhammad went to Medina, which is about 400 kilometers away. He built a community there and started a new life. The Quraysh were not happy about this. They saw Medina as a threat. They wanted to crush it. So in 627, they marched on Medina with a mighty army of more than 4,000 men. And then the weather took a turn. Strong winds started blowing sand into the Muslim camp, making it difficult to breathe. Then it started raining heavily. This was the worst nightmare for the Quraysh. The Arab armies were not used to fighting in bad weather. They did not have proper raincoats or boots. When the skies opened up, their weapons got wet and heavy. They became almost useless. Plus, there was no place to take cover. There was the ditch on one side and the enemy on the other. So the Quraysh were stuck in the open with no way out. At least 2,000 of them died of exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. The rest surrendered. Muhammad had won a brilliant victory without even having to resort to a full-scale attack. He had beaten the biggest tribe in Arabia. In fact, he had humiliated them, and this changed things. The Battle of Trench showed the Arabs that raw strength was not the only way to win a war. Brains could be a better weapon. Muhammad was not a warrior, but a teacher. He tried to lead by example, but even he knew when to fight and when to forgive. We'll come back to this story. First, let me show you the map. Here's where Medina is. To its south is Mecca. Both cities are in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Now let's go back in time. The year is 610. Muhammad is 40 years old, and he's worried about his people. The Meccans worshipped multiple gods. They also indulged in fierce arguments over who was right and who was wrong. It was a time when monotheism was spreading in Arabia. Abraham's son Ismail lived in Mecca. Some believe he was the first to preach one God. Later, prophets like Musa, Isa, or Jesus visited Mecca. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was the last in line. That's what he believed, at least. One day, while meditating in a cave near Mecca, Muhammad is said to have heard the voice of God. He became the messenger of God, or so he believed. Now, Muhammad was not the first Arab to claim that he spoke for God. Many others had made that claim before him. But Muhammad had a gift. He could explain complex ideas simply. He could connect with common people. Slowly, his message began to spread. He preached about one God, about heaven and hell, about the rights of women, about kindness to animals, about honesty and hard work. His message appealed to many. Soon enough, he had thousands of followers. They were called Muslims, or those who submitted to the will of God. Muhammad's followers came from all backgrounds, rich and poor, young and old, slave and master. But this did not appeal to everyone, especially the Quraysh. They were the most powerful tribe in Mecca. They controlled trade, and they reaped most of the benefits of the city's prosperity. The Quraysh ran the Kaaba. This is a structure in Mecca. It was originally a small building made of black stone. But over the years, the Quraysh expanded it, became bigger and grander, and the Quraysh took pride in this. After all, it was their job to maintain it. They saw Muhammad and his followers as a challenge to their authority. They argued with the Muslims. They harassed them. They beat them up. So Muhammad told his followers to leave Mecca and settle elsewhere. This is how the Muslims came to Medina. There was no love lost between the two cities. The Meccans kept plotting to destroy Muhammad. This meant constant attacks on Medina. So Muhammad's followers built a wall to protect themselves. And that's when the Quraysh decided to teach them a lesson. They assembled an army of more than 4,000 men and marched on Medina. Like I mentioned, Muhammad was not scared. He had a plan. He asked the Muslims to dig a trench. This was something the Arabs had never seen before. Basically, it was a long and wide ditch, deep enough to prevent the enemy from crossing over. Muhammad divided his men into 3 groups. One group guarded the eastern side of the trench. Another was stationed near the western exit. The third was deployed in the center. Its job was to guard the bridge that connected both ends. On the other side of the trench, the Quraysh were confused. What were the Muslims trying to do? Why had they abandoned the city walls? Was this some kind of trick? The Meccan commanders couldn't figure it out. They kept attacking, but every time they lost more men. The cavalry horses were their biggest strength, but now they were useless. They charged at the ditch again and again, but nobody crossed over. Each attack was repelled. The Meccans lost hundreds of men. Their condition worsened. It was summer. It was hot and dry. Plus, none of them had any experience fighting in the open. They did not know how to deal with exhaustion, with flies, with sandstorms, yet they kept attacking. In the end, it was a humiliating defeat. The Quraysh lost hundreds of men. The survivors returned to Mecca empty-handed. The Muslims had shown them that strategy could be more powerful than swordplay. Having said that, sometimes diplomacy also plays a part. When Muhammad and his followers entered Mecca in 630, the Meccans were terrified. They thought there would be a bloodbath. You see, Mecca was the holiest city in Islam, and now it had fallen into the hands of the Muslims. They could easily take revenge on their tormentors. But Muhammad shocked them. He granted amnesty to many enemies. He spared those who had persecuted him, even pardoned the polytheists. Soon, the proud city which had rejected Islam embraced Islam itself. Muhammad may have been a messenger of God, but he was also a leader. And good leaders don't just inspire, they also unite. Within a single generation, the Muslims had united the entire Arabian Peninsula. Today, more than 1.8 billion people follow Islam. It is the second largest religion in the world. This is a story of how it began, a story of courage, conviction, and strategy. When Muhammad passed away in the year 632, a great question arose. Who would lead the Ummah, the community of Muslims? The answer was the caliphs, meaning successors. The first Abu Bakr was one of the Prophet's closest companions. Under him and his successors, Islam became not only a religion, but an expanding empire. In a few decades, they defeated the Byzantines in Syria, seizing Damascus and Jerusalem. They crushed the mighty Sassanid Empire of Persia. They captured Alexandria in 642, dealing a heavy blow to Byzantine trade. And finally, they swept across North Africa, from Egypt to Morocco. Incredibly, just half a century after Muhammad's death, the banner of Islam flew from the Middle East to the Atlantic Ocean. But why? Why did Islam expand so quickly? I'm the host, and you're watching this channel. Join me to find out. To answer our question, we need to understand three things about early Islam. First, its message. Second, its military strength. And third, the political situation at the time. First, the message. Islam meant submission to the one true God, Allah. It offered a simple path to salvation through faith and good works, which appealed to people of all social classes. Its message was universal, preached not only to Arabs, but also Jews and Christians. For example, Muhammad said, "O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female, and made you into peoples and tribes, so that you may get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous among you." So it wasn't just an Arab religion. Indeed, Islam spread rapidly beyond the Arabian Peninsula because it attracted converts from various backgrounds. Second, military strength. Early Muslims were united and disciplined, willing to fight and die for their faith. When the Meccans persecuted the Muslims, they fled to Medina in 622. This event, called the Hejra, marked the beginning of the Muslim calendar. In Medina, Muhammad formed a community, the Ummah, which was both religious and political, created a constitution known as the Medina Charter, which outlined the rights and duties of its members. The charter aimed to solve problems within the community by emphasizing justice, equality, and consultation. But it also established rules for fighting wars. War was considered a duty when necessary for defense, or to protect the weak. Battles like Badr and Uhud showed the bravery and determination of the Muslims. Importantly, prisoners of war were usually treated well, which helped spread Islam as prisoners often became converts after seeing the Muslims' generosity. For example, after the Battle of Badr in 624, where Muslims defeated the Meccans, Muhammad freed all 70 prisoners he took, urging his followers to show mercy. This act had a profound impact on one prisoner named Suhail B. Omir, who later converted to Islam and played a significant role in its spread. As he narrated, I saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, treating the prisoners generously. His behavior led many of our prisoners to accept Islam, including myself. Had he maltreated them, perhaps some of us would have preferred death to embracing Islam. By the time of Muhammad's death, Islam was a growing force in Arabia with around 100,000 followers. Though he didn't live to see it, he laid the foundation for its rapid expansion after his death. Third, the political situation. At the time of Muhammad, the Middle East was ruled by two great empires, the Sassanids and the Byzantines. Both were exhausted from years of warfare. The Sassanid Empire, also called the Persian Empire, stretched from Central Asia to the Arabian Peninsula and parts of North Africa. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire covered the eastern half of the former Roman Empire, including modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Egypt. These two powers were locked in a long conflict, diverting their resources and attention from other threats. Moreover, both empires were burdened by internal issues. In the Sassanid Empire, the king was considered divine, leading to dissatisfaction among non-believers. Additionally, the vast empire was difficult to manage, causing administrative challenges. Similarly, the Byzantine Empire faced issues with taxation and corruption. Emperor Heraclius, who ruled from 610 to 641, attempted reforms, but these proved unpopular, particularly among the wealthy elite. Internal instability contributed to the empire's vulnerability, making it susceptible to external pressures, such as those exerted by the expanding Muslim forces. This context allowed the newly formed Muslim state to take advantage of the rival's weaknesses and grow rapidly. So with these three factors, the message, the strength, and the circumstances, Islam expanded rapidly. After Muhammad's death, Abu Bakr became the first caliph. Facing internal rebellions, he appointed military leaders like the famous Khalid ibn al-Walid to put down uprisings and enforce Islamic rule. One notable victory was the Battle of Yamama in 633, where Khalid ibn al-Walid defeated a rebel force led by Musaylima, the false prophet. This battle solidified Abu Bakr's authority and set the stage for further expansion. Soon after, Muslims started to conquer Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Umar, the second caliph, continued this trend, overseeing the conquest of Egypt, Palestine, North Africa, and parts of Central Asia. The Muslim armies moved swiftly, employing guerrilla tactics and exploiting the rivals' weaknesses. For instance, in 634, the Muslims won a decisive victory against the Sassanids at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. This success was due to their adoption of flexible military strategies, which involved hit-and-run tactics and a deep knowledge of the terrain, exploiting the enemy's vulnerabilities and using superior cavalry tactics. The Muslims triumphed, marking a turning point in the conflict between the two empires. The conquests brought immense wealth to the Muslim world. The treasury of the Sassanid Empire was taken to Medina, containing gold, silver, clothing, and books. Conquering Syria and Egypt allowed access to new agricultural lands, trade routes, and cultural centers. For example, Muslim conquest of Egypt in 640 brought valuable agricultural lands, access to the Nile River, and control over important trade routes. It also exposed Muslims to Greek and Roman texts, fostering intellectual growth. So how did the Muslims achieve all these military victories? We can identify 4 factors here. First, superior cavalry tactics. Muslims adopted and adapted equestrian techniques from various sources, including Persians and Central Asians. They used mounted archers effectively, enabling hit-and-run tactics and rapid maneuverability. Second, the use of gunpowder, according to history. While not a decisive factor in early Muslim military victories, gunpowder played a role. It arrived in the Islamic world via trade with China. Initially used for fireworks, it later found military applications. By the 9th century, Muslim armies incorporated basic firearms and cannons. Third, light armor. Like the heavy armor worn by European knights, early Muslim warriors favored lighter clothing. This allowed for greater mobility and flexibility during battles. Finally, military organization. While not possessing large standing armies, the Muslim states were effective. During the Rashidun Caliphate, 632 to 661, armies were raised for specific campaigns. Generals like Amr ibn al-As and Khalid ibn al-Walid played vital roles in organizing and leading troops. Moreover, the concept of jihad encouraged Muslims to participate in military activities. In conclusion, the rapid rise of Islam can be attributed to several factors. Its simple message of submission to one God appealed to diverse populations beyond the Arabian Peninsula. The disciplined and zealous Muslim community was prepared to fight and spread their faith. Additionally, the political climate at the time, marked by rival empires weakened by internal strife and external conflicts, provided an opportunity for the nascent Muslim state to flourish. The combination of these factors, along with effective military tactics and strategies, enabled the swift expansion of Islam, transforming it from a small community in Arabia to a major force in the Middle East and North Africa within just a few decades. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below to share your thoughts on the factors that contributed to the rapid rise of Islam. We look forward to seeing you in the next video. But the story did not stop. In 711, Muslim forces crossed into Spain, defeating the Visigoths. Soon they controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. And then they looked north, to Francia, modern-day France. In 732, under Emir Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, Muslim armies surged into southern France, capturing Bordeaux and advancing towards Tours. Europe trembled. It seemed Islam might soon stretch from Spain into the very heart of Europe. But then came a man called Charles Martel, the Hammer, leader of the Franks. He gathered his warriors to defend Christendom. On the 10th of October, 732, near Tours, two great armies clashed. The battle was fierce, like a final cricket match between India and Pakistan, where no side can afford to lose. For several days they fought, until finally the Muslims were pushed back. Abdul Rahman fell, and the Muslim army retreated to Spain. The Battle of Tours became the halting point. It halted the northward expansion of Islam in Europe. Hello, and welcome to this channel. Today we will see what would have happened if the Muslim armies had won at Tours. Do you know that before the Battle of Tours, Muslims ruled over almost the entire Iberian Peninsula? They entered Spain in 711. Within 60 years they had defeated the Visigoths and taken control of most of the region. Why did they attack France then? Because they had two things: ambition and momentum. Once they realized that the Christian kingdoms of the north could not resist them, they began planning for expansion. In 721, they captured Narbonne. 2 years later, they seized Bordeaux and advanced into the Frankish territory. Who were these Muslim invaders? Who was their leader? What was their goal? Let me tell you. In the early 8th century, most of Spain was ruled by the Umayyad Caliphate. It was based in Damascus, Syria. Under them, the Iberian Peninsula was a province called Al-Andalus. In 711, the governor of Al-Andalus, Musa ibn Nusar, decided to conquer the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo. He sent an army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad across the Strait of Gibraltar. They landed in the south of Spain and defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Guadalete. Soon, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim rule. The Umayyad Caliphate had many provinces. Most were unruly, so the caliphs kept moving their capital. 756 it shifted to Cordoba. A new emirate was created, independent from the caliph. It was ruled by Abd al-Rahman I, then came his son, Abd al-Rahman II, who ruled from 756 to 788. Under him, Cordoba became one of the most important cities in the caliphate. He was ambitious, but he could not expand because of the threat from the north. In those days, the northern Spanish kingdoms of Asturias and Pamplona were resisting the Muslims. In 778, al-Rahman II wanted to crush them. He sent an army to the north, but it suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Roncesvalles. Discouraged, Abd al-Rahman II returned to Cordoba. His son Abu Bakr al-Khalidi took the throne in 788. Like his father, he too dreamed of conquering the north. And he had a capable general, Abd al-Malik ibn Qatsir al-Ghafiqi, or Emir Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi. It was he who led the invasion of France in 732. So what exactly was the goal? Was it to convert Europe to Islam? Not really. European historians used to say that the Muslims wanted to convert the whole of Europe to Islam. Turns out that's not true. According to historians like Thomas F. Glick, there is no evidence that Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi was motivated by any religious zeal. He was interested in expanding his domain and plundering the riches of Francia. Let's talk about the Franks now. Who were they? Where did they live? The word Frank comes from the Germanic word for free people. The Franks were a group of people living in what is today France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and the Netherlands. They were divided into many small kingdoms. One of them was ruled by a man named Charles Martel. He was the mayor of the palace. Technically, the king was the head of the Frankish realm, but in reality Charles Martel held the real power. He was called the Hammer. Historians say Martel was a ruthless warrior. Legend has it that once he walked barefoot 60 miles in a single night to save a friend in a fight. Another time he saved a bridge from falling apart so that he could beat a rebel king. It seems Martel was also a shrewd administrator. He reformed the Frankish army, introduced a new system of taxation, and appointed loyal deputies to collect taxes. He encouraged trade and made the Frankish kingdom prosperous. Now all of these factors helped him build a formidable army. How big was this army? When Martel rallied his troops to fight the Muslims, they numbered about 40,000. A lot of them were not professional soldiers. Farmers, traders, artisans, they all picked up arms to defend their land. And then there were the elite warriors, the cavalrymen. Well-trained and well-equipped, they were the backbone of the army. When Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi and his men entered France in 732, they found a strong Frankish army waiting to take them on. So who were they fighting for? Well, primarily for God. You see, Europe in the 8th century was largely Christian. Most of the people who lived there followed the Roman Catholic Church. They were called the Franks. Their ruler, Charles Martel, was a devout Catholic. When he learned that Muslims were attacking his lands, he saw it as a war between two religions. To fight the Muslims, he got the support of neighboring kingdoms. He also convinced the Pope to bless his arms. As for the Muslims, they were united by their faith in Islam. They had come from different parts of the empire. But once they entered the battlefield, they were united by one goal: victory. Where did these two armies meet? At the Battle of Tours, in October 732, two armies met near the city of Tours, which is about 200 miles south of Paris. The Battle of Tours lasted only 3 days. It ended on the 10th of October 732. That day is celebrated as the Feast of Tours. Historian Thomas F. Glick describes it as the West's victory over the forces of Islam. With the Muslims gone, Charles Martel reorganized his realm. The Frankish kingdom flourished. By the year 800, it stretched from the North Sea to the Pyrenees Mountains. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, was crowned king of the Franks by Pope Stephen II. 2 centuries later, another Frankish king, Charlemagne, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Now, let's talk about what would have happened if the Muslims had won the Battle of Tours. If they had won, they would have marched on Paris and the rest of northern Europe. But do you know that? There is some debate over whether the Muslims would have done that even if they had the chance. Historian Thomas F. Glick says it's unlikely that the Muslims would have done that. Says the idea that they would march on Rome or Paris is a myth. He says that though ambitious, the Umayyad rulers of Cordoba were pragmatic. They knew how to exploit their opponents' weaknesses. Once they plundered monasteries and churches, they withdrew. They never tried to capture the Frankish capital. Why? Perhaps because they knew that doing so would require huge resources and manpower. Perhaps they were satisfied with what they had already achieved. Another reason why the Muslims may not have attacked the rest of Europe was the revolt in their home province. Soon after the Battle of Tours, the Berber people revolted against the Umayyads. They were tired of paying taxes. They did not want to be ruled by the Arabs, so they rebelled. This revolt, by the way, led to the establishment of a new state in North Africa. It was called the Idrisid Caliphate. It was founded by Idris I in 788. And all of this is to say that the Muslim rulers in Spain were distracted. By the late 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula had become a battleground. Not only were the Berbers rebelling in the south, but in the north, the Christians had regrouped. They were no longer willing to accept defeat. So the Muslim rulers in Spain had enough problems of their own. They did not need to look north for more. But what if I told you that someone did look north? Amir Abd al-Rahman III. He was the grandson of the man who had invaded France in 732. By the time he came to power, the Iberian Peninsula was fragmented. Several small states ruled over its various regions. Abd al-Rahman III wanted to unite the Muslims of Spain again. He also wanted to punish the Christians for the humiliation at Tours. So in 973, he invaded northern Spain. He recaptured several towns that had been lost to the Christians. Abd al-Rahman III also launched sea raids. He attacked the coasts of France, England, and Ireland. But he stopped short of invading the interior. He stayed away from places like Paris. So even though Abd al-Rahman III was ambitious, even though he dreamed of making Cordoba great again, he did not invade northern Europe. He stuck to what he knew best, plundering coastal cities. Why am I telling you all this? To tell you that history is complex. Events in the distant past affect our world today. Even a battle fought 1,200 years ago continues to influence the course of European history. Thank you for watching. Just imagine, if the battle had gone the other way, Paris today might echo with the call to prayer instead of church bells. And who knows, instead of croissants, the French breakfast might have been samosas. Welcome to my channel. But while the West was sweating to keep the cross safe from the crescent, in the East, another empire was shining, where poetry, philosophy, and noodles alike reached glorious heights. That was Tang China, and from there, the story will flow towards one of Europe's greatest kings, Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a towering figure in European history, the king who more than any other turned back, the Muslim-tied the man who created the Carolingian Renaissance, and the ruler, whose empire stretched from the North Sea to the Byzantine Empire. But it could so easily have been otherwise. When his father, Pepin the Short, seized the Frankish throne in 751, the Muslim armies were at the gates of Paris. Within a generation, they'd be pushed back beyond the Pyrenees. And the following century would see the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula start to push northwards. Yet for all the focus on the wars against the Muslims, those conflicts only form one part of Charlemagne's story. For he was also the inheritor of a cultural legacy stretching back to the Roman Empire, which he sought to revive through education, the arts, and above all, the law. In fact, he was arguably the first modern European, a medieval man with Renaissance ideals. So how did this Renaissance man come to power? Well, let me tell you about his empire. At its greatest extent, it encompassed all of modern France, plus bits of Germany, Italy, Spain, and even England. It was a realm that spanned over 250,000 square miles, bigger even than modern Brazil. But like all good things, it started small. After defeating the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, Pepin decided to reward his soldiers with some land. He granted them estates across his empire, granting them noble titles in exchange for military service. This practice of granting land in exchange for loyalty would become known as feudalism. And while it's often portrayed as a rigid system of obligation, for our peasant ancestors, it actually offered some pretty sweet perks. I mean, these guys got free stuff and didn't even have to pay taxes. In return, they owed their lord 3 days of labor per week, plus military service when called upon. Not too shabby for what was essentially an investment opportunity. As for Charlemagne, he got the benefits of a large, loyal army without having to pay them. Everyone wins. The empire's administrative center was in the palace complex at Aachen, near modern-day Germany. Here scribes toiled away, copying manuscripts, creating some of the most beautiful books of the era. The empire was mostly Christian, but Charlemagne encouraged religious tolerance, allowing Jews and Muslims to practice their faiths within his realm. He even had a Jewish mint, producing coins with the inscription, Charlemagne, King of the Jews. And his court was remarkably cosmopolitan, with people from across his empire attending its many festivals. But perhaps surprisingly, given his reputation as a warrior king, only around 8% of the population were soldiers. The vast majority of people in his empire were farmers, producing enough food to not only feed the population, but also generate a surplus for trade. In fact, trade was booming across Europe during the 8th and 9th centuries. Italian merchants were trading with the Byzantine Empire, while Vikings were sailing across the North Sea, establishing trading posts as far away as the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. And while all this was going on, the Islamic world was entering its golden age. The great caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty were patrons of the arts. encouraging scholarship and scientific research across their vast domains. They produced stunning works of art, exquisite carpets, and even invented algebra. Indeed, during the Golden Age of Islam, Muslim scholars translated thousands of Greek texts into Arabic, preserving them for future generations. They made groundbreaking discoveries in astronomy, medicine, and optics, and developed new manufacturing techniques like glass-making and chemical processes. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Charlemagne was busy getting crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III in the year 800. It was a title that linked him directly to the emperors of Rome and gave him a new legitimacy on the world stage. Yet despite his many achievements, his empire would soon collapse. As the 9th century drew to a close, rival nobles seized power in France, Germany, and Italy. And by the year 1000, the Carolingian dynasty was a thing of the past. Still, the empire's legacy lived on in the legal codes, artistic motifs, and educational reforms that inspired future generations. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that without Charlemagne, Europe might have looked very different today. Thanks for watching. So now let's talk about the Dark Ages in Europe. But while we do that, let me ask you this. Did you know that in modern-day France, Switzerland, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and England, every single day 40,000 tons of garbage is produced? But don't worry, because every year around 6 million tons of this waste is recycled, so that's great news. Well done, Europe. But wait, maybe you should feel a little less proud. You see, back in the Middle Ages, the population of Europe was just 5 to 6 million. So those 40,000 tons of garbage produced each day by Europeans today is equal to the waste produced by the entire population of medieval Europe in one day. Just think about it. In those days, there were no plastic bottles, no metal cans, no paper cups. Yet somehow the per capita waste production was much higher then than now. How could this be possible? Well, if you want to find out how Europeans managed to produce so much waste without producing any plastic, watch this show till the end. You will also learn how every religion got along in ancient China, why Europe was not ready for recycling, and how China was 80 years ahead of the world. All this and more next. When the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Europe plunged into darkness. The wheel of progress stopped turning. Everything that the Romans had built over 900 years was destroyed within just 3 centuries. Monasteries, schools, aqueducts, roads, public works. But among the very few things that survived were classic Roman texts. And even though Europe had fallen into the Dark Ages, these texts kept getting copied from one manuscript to another. For over 500 years, monks toiled in scriptoria, these small rooms inside monasteries where manuscripts were copied. They pored over books by Roman philosophers like Cicero and Quintilian, by Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid, and by Roman historians like Livy and Suetonius. And you know what else they copied? Roman accounts of the good old days when Rome ruled the world. These stories would have sounded like fairy tales to European peasants, who lived under feudal lords, who worked from dusk till dawn in fields or factories, who paid taxes to the king, who couldn't travel without getting robbed, and whose children were going hungry. Naturally, they wondered, when will our time come? Will our country ever rule the world again? Now, meanwhile, in the Far East, in China, it was the Tang dynasty. Between 618 and 907 AD, China thrived like never before. It grew rich, it grew powerful, and most importantly, it grew peaceable. At that time, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism were the 3 major religions of China. There was no tension among them. A person could practice any religion he or she wanted. The state did not care. Buddhism was popular among the masses. Taoism was favored by the elite. And Confucianism provided the glue that held society together. Also, unlike Europe, China's intellectual class wasn't confined to monks and priests. Here, Buddhist monks, Taoist priests, and Confucian scholars all contributed to the golden age of Tang poetry. Some of the best-known names from this era are Li Bai, also called Li Po, Wang Wei, Meng Haoren, and Du Fo. Their poems celebrated nature, life, friendship, and wine. They found beauty in simple things. Take this poem by Wang Wei, for example. He writes about a morning scene on a ship. A lone boat floats in the midst of autumn waters. Willows and poplars line the shore. Geese honk wildly overhead. Fishermen sing as they cast their nets. On the stern, a boy plays his sheng, the sound echoing over the waves. What a beautiful picture he paints, isn't it? Now compare that to your average European monk who spends his days praying, reading a Bible, and copying manuscripts. Can you imagine him penning something like that? To get back to Wang Wei, he's also credited with painting the first landscape painting in Chinese art history. Before him, Chinese paintings mostly depicted historical events, mythological scenes, and courtly life. But Wang Wei's mind found solace in nature. He painted mountains, rivers, and trees, sometimes adding human figures to them, sometimes leaving them out. His style greatly influenced later Chinese painters like Fan Quan and Guoxi. The flourishing of arts wasn't restricted to monasteries. In fact, under the Tang dynasty, the Chinese invented printing, although initially it was used only to print Buddhist texts. To make prints, they carved wooden blocks, dipped them in ink, and pressed them on cloth or paper. And the first book to be printed in this manner was the Diamond Sutra. That happened in 650 AD, that's 80 years before. Johannes Gutenberg invented printing in Europe. So to sum up, the Tang dynasty was a golden age in Chinese history. A period of economic prosperity, territorial expansion, cultural flourishing, and peaceful coexistence of religions. It was the exact opposite of Europe at that time. And yet Europe remembers this era as the Dark Ages. Why? Well, because Europe was caught up in its own problems. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Germanic tribes had established several kingdoms in Western Europe. Frankish king Clovis I united these kingdoms and defeated the Visigoths. He expanded his rule and converted to Christianity. This set the tone for the future of Europe. Kings began taking the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Popes gained political power. Religious orders mushroomed across the continent. By the year 800, almost the entire Western Europe was Christian. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe remained predominantly pagan. In the 8th century, the Franks were ruled by Charlemagne, the first king of the Carolingian Empire. Historians debate whether he ended the Dark Ages or merely delayed their end. Either way, he left behind a legacy. His empire promoted education, founded schools, and encouraged people to study classics. But the Carolingian Renaissance, as it's called, was short-lived. As soon as Charles the Bald ascended to the throne after Charlemagne's death, everything went downhill. Soon the empire disintegrated. Feudalism returned to Europe, and the continent was divided among competing kingdoms. During this period, Western Europe saw two major invasions, one by the Vikings and the other by the Magyars. The Vikings came from Scandinavia. They were expert sailors. They raided along the coasts, traveled inland through rivers, and emerged as formidable warriors. No kingdom was safe from them. From the British Isles to North Africa, from France to the Byzantine Empire, nobody could stop the Vikings. Fortunately for Europe, many of them eventually settled down. Instead of raiding, they started trading. And this turned out to be lucky for Europe, because Viking merchants carried new ideas, new products, and new experiences from Asia to the West. They introduced Europeans to spices like pepper and cinnamon. They brought in furs from Scandinavia and amber from the Baltic coast. They traded textiles from the Byzantine Empire and glassware from the Arab lands. Do you know what else they brought to Europe? The concept of banking? Yes, the first checks were written during the Viking Age. Merchants gave them to their bankers, who would then pay the amount mentioned on them to the seller on their behalf. This saved merchants the trouble of carrying gold and silver around. Also, when they traveled abroad, they could use checks to buy things. That way, trade became easier and safer. And since they couldn't read or write English, Latin, or French, merchants and traders preferred writing checks in Arabic. Anyway, the Magyar invasion came a little later. In the late 9th century, a group of nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppes entered Europe, were led by a man named Magyar. He was killed in battle against the Franks, but his followers kept pouring into Europe. They forced the Byzantines to pay them to leave their land alone. Then they headed west, defeating everyone on their way. Eventually, they settled in what is today Hungary. These two invasions transformed Europe forever. The Vikings opened up new trade routes and exposed Europeans to new ideas. The Magyars, on the other hand, created a new kingdom in Europe and triggered a massive shift in population. People fled their homes in the east and settled in the west, leading to the gradual depopulation of the eastern half of the continent. So coming back to the question I asked at the beginning of this episode, can you guess how Europeans managed to produce so much trash without producing any plastic? Well, the answer is wood. Tons and tons of wood. You see, in the absence of modern technology, people used wood for fuel, construction, heating, cooking, even disposing off human waste. But as demand for wood increased, forests were cut down. And this had dire consequences for the environment. Without trees to hold back soil, it started eroding. Farmlands turned into badlands. The climate changed. Winters became colder. Summers were wetter. Agriculture suffered. People faced food shortages. The problem was so severe that between 1315 and 1317, a series of famines struck Europe. This was followed by the Black Death, which killed 30 to 50% of the population. All in all, the Middle Ages in Europe were a period of misery, poverty, disease, and death. Waste disposal was the least of their problems. That's why today, when we generate 40,000 tons of garbage daily, the per capita waste generation is much lower than in the Dark Ages. Now, what do you think? Was Europe really in Dark Ages? Was it just a victim of circumstances? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Imagine waking up one day in 800 AD and realizing you are now the most powerful man in Europe. Not only are you the king of a vast empire stretching from the North Sea to the Alps and from the Atlantic Ocean to northern Italy, but also the newly crowned Holy Roman Emperor. You have defeated the Lombards, the Saxons, and the Avars. You have conquered new lands in Bavaria and Spain. Your armies have driven back the Muslims north of the Pyrenees. You are the champion of Christendom who will be attending the First Council of Nicaea to fight heresy. You're basically Europe's one good guy and everyone wants to be your friend, at least on paper. Your name is Charlemagne, but everyone calls you Charles the Great. And let's be honest, it fits. You were born around 742 in what today we call Belgium. The son of the Frankish king Pepin, the short Pepin, mind you, was short in stature, but big in ambition. After seizing power from the previous Frankish king, Chilperic, who had committed the unforgivable sin of beating his queen to death, Pepin decided to bolster his legitimacy by doing two things: make an alliance with the Pope and conquer some Lombard territory. Both endeavors would prove successful. In 754, Pope Zachary crowned Pepin and his wife Bertrada of Leon the new king and queen of the Franks. And in 756, Pepin defeated the Lombards decisively at the Battle of the River Tordo and pushed them all the way back to the Po Valley. In return for this valuable service, the grateful Pope gifted Pepin with the title Patrician of the Romans. Plus, in 761, Pepin defeated the last Lombard king, Desiderius, ending the Lombard threat to northern Italy forever. It looked like the Franks had reached the pinnacle of their power. But unfortunately, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, as the Italians would soon start calling him, was only 9 years old when his father became king, so he didn't really have anything to do with any of these successes. His childhood was spent in the care of Alcuin of York, a former monk who taught the young prince Latin grammar, philosophy, and theology, hoping to turn him into something resembling a Renaissance polymath. The rest of Charlemagne's education consisted of learning how to ride a horse, hunt wild boar, play the harp, sing Bodhi songs, and generally behave like a Viking. By age 16, though, his father decided he was ready to rule. In 758, Pepin the Short died, and Charlemagne became king of the Franks. And what does a young, ambitious ruler do with his new power? Well, he expands his kingdom, of course. Over the next several decades, Charles the Great went to war nearly every year, usually against the Saxons. By 772, after a brutal campaign, he had subdued them completely and forced them to convert to Christianity. But he also waged war against the Avars, the Slavic tribes east of the Danube, the Lombards again, who had tried to come back. By 778, he had defeated them all, having taken Milan, Pavia, and the entire region around the Po Valley. This victory over the Lombards had two major consequences. First, northern Italy had just become part of the Frankish kingdom. Second, the Pope was now more dependent on the Franks than ever before. So much so that Leo III had to visit Charlemagne in person to secure his support against his rivals in Rome. And what did Charles get out of this deal? How about a nice hat trick? Later that same year, while in Rome, The Frankish king was crowned King of Italy by Pope Leo III. Then came the Muslim invasion of France in 785, which Charles repelled. In 793, he took up arms against the rebellious Saxons once again, defeating them again. And in 799, Pope Leo III was almost murdered by his own brother. Once again, Charles came to the rescue. Having secured his northern border with the Treaty of Verdun in 798, the Frankish king set out south to bring Pope Leo III back to the papal throne. When he arrived in Rome, he rode in on a golden chariot, accompanied by 40 elephants and 1,000 horsemen. He celebrated Christmas in St. Peter's Basilica. And on December, probably in the middle of the night, Pope Leo III secretly placed a gold crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Augustus. The first emperor of the Romans since Romulus Augustulus had been deposed in 476. Now, no one knows exactly why he did this. Maybe the coronation was supposed to be a grand New Year's Eve surprise. Maybe the Pope genuinely believed he was bestowing the crown upon the new Caesar of Rome. Or maybe, just maybe, he understood perfectly well what a headache the unruly Frankish emperors had become for the papacy and figured he could use the imperial crown as leverage, turning Charles the Great into Charles the Humble, whatever his motivations. The crowning ceremony was a shock, not only for Charles, who must have woken up thinking he had just had a very vivid dream, but for everyone else as well. The idea that the western half of the old Roman Empire had somehow been revived was simply too bonkers to be true. Well, at least according to everyone except Pope Leo III, who placed the crown on Charles's head and the handful of bishops and counts who attended the ceremony. As far as they were concerned, Rome was once again the center of the world. But unfortunately, Charles the Great was a bit busy waging war against the Saxons to care much about this particular honor. It wouldn't be until 800 to 6 years later that he finally submitted his request for the title of Augustus. He received it without much fanfare. For the rest of his reign, Charlemagne remained obsessed with the Saxons, fighting them every chance he got. He also took on the Avars again, as well as the Danes, the Moravians, and the Principality of Benevento. Yet somehow during all this campaigning, he found time to write a book about his life and deeds. He established schools across his realm, reformed the Frankish calendar, and even started work on the famous Carolingian minuscule, a revolutionary style of handwriting that made books cheaper and easier to produce. Additionally, in 794, he founded the Palace School of Aachen, which would become one of the most renowned centers of learning in Europe. And in 801, he hosted a conference of 300 scholars at that school, where they worked on translating ancient Greek texts into Latin. Sadly, Charlemagne's obsession with the Saxons prevented him from enjoying any of these accomplishments. For the next 18 years, he kept trying to force them to accept Christianity, even though they had already elected a Christian king, but he never succeeded. Instead, in 814, he fell ill while on campaign and died 2 months later in January. So who was Charlemagne? A ruthless conqueror, a patron of the arts, an educational reformer, a bigot, perhaps all of those things. One thing is certain, however, Charles the Great was not cut out to be an emperor. The title might have brought prestige and power to the Frankish kings, but it was too closely linked to the glories of the past and the expectations that came with it. You see, throughout the early Middle Ages, the legacy of Rome loomed large over Western Europe. Its ruins were still standing, and everyone wanted to be part of its rebirth. That's why there was such a big fuss over the donation of Pepin, the gift of land that the Pope gave to the Frankish king in 754. Everyone thought it was the key to reviving the empire. But the reality was that it wasn't. The donation of Pepin was essentially useless. All it did was grant the Franks control over some Italian bishop's sees. It had nothing to do with the original Roman provinces. Although Charlemagne did add large parts of northern Italy to his kingdom, that didn't mean he was ruling Rome or even living there. Not to mention that the Byzantines also claimed to be the true successors of Rome. Why should a barbarian king from the north get to wear the imperial crown? According to them, only the legitimate emperor of Constantinople could do that. Moreover, it wasn't as if the rest of Europe was particularly happy about a Frankish emperor either. Sure, the Pope was thrilled, but the rest of Italy saw the donation of Pepin as a declaration of war and resisted the Frankish occupation fiercely. Furthermore, the king of the Lombards, Desiderius, also called himself King of Italy, and the people probably believed him. The same was true of the dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, and the other Frankish neighbors, who considered the imperial title yet another attempt by the Franks to dominate them. In the end, the coronation of Charlemagne was a confusing message for everyone. If the Franks were becoming the Roman Empire, then why were they still fighting so many wars? If they were restoring the old order, then why did their rulers seem so eager to keep fighting? Sadly, no one asked that question because hardly anyone understood what was going on anyway. The whole thing was a complete disaster. After Charlemagne's death, his son Louis, the Pious, inherited the title of Augustus. But he was too weak and indecisive to maintain his father's empire. By 843, it broke apart, splitting the Frankish inheritance into the West Frankish Kingdom, future France, the East Frankish Kingdom, future Germany, and the short-lived Middle Kingdom. Meanwhile, outside enemies, the Vikings, Magyars, Hungarians, kept attacking. Ordinary people lost faith in the ability of the distant kings to protect them and turned to local lords for protection instead. And thus feudalism was born, a system in which peasants worked the land, knights fought the battles, and nobles ruled in the name of the king, who distributed land to the nobles in exchange for their loyalty. Above all stood the Pope, claiming ultimate authority from God himself. To watch our full series on the Middle Ages, check the description below. But who were these attackers causing such chaos? Enter the Vikings. On the 8th of June 793, they raided Lindisfarne, a small island monastery in England, famous for its holy books. The monks expected peace, but instead came warriors with axes, beards, and bad manners. They looted, killed, and enslaved, shocking all of Europe. That day marked the start of the Viking Age. For over a century, Vikings terrorized Europe, raiding England, France, Germany, even reaching Italy. Their names spread fear. But they weren't only raiders, they were traders and explorers too. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, where Leif Erikson discovered Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland, Canada. It's me. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out more about the Vikings. But before we begin, let's settle an argument once and for all. Were Vikings really Vikings? Well, yes, the word Viking does, in fact, refer to a Scandinavian warrior who lived between the 8th and 11th centuries AD. But why were they called Vikings? The word Viking comes from the Old Norse word, which means to go on a raid or to pirate. So technically, the word Viking is actually a job title. It refers to a person who goes a Viking, that is, a person who raids. Today we would probably call them mercenaries. But during the Middle Ages, people across Europe came to know them as Vikings. In fact, their names struck fear in the hearts of the common folk, so much so that even today, the word Viking is synonymous with ruthless killers, isn't it? But were they really all bad? Well, not really. See, the thing about Vikings is they weren't just raiders, they were also traders and explorers. But we'll get to that later. First, let's talk about their raids. The first Viking raid took place in 793 AD at Lindisfarne. This monastery was famous for its collection of holy books. In fact, it was considered one of the most pious places in England. So when a band of marauders attacked and destroyed it, Europe was shocked. And who were these attackers? We now know them as Vikings. They were Scandinavian seafarers from what is today Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In fact, during the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, these warriors sailed across Europe, pillaging on monasteries and trading posts. At times they attacked for fun, sometimes for money, and often because they had nothing better to do. I mean, these guys were fierce fighters, some of the best in Europe. So when they got bored of fighting each other, they turned to pillage, and there was no stopping them. Vikings raided England, France, Germany, even Italy. They were responsible for some of the most audacious attacks in history. In 865 AD, a Viking army of around 200 ships landed in Paris and held the city hostage until they received a ransom. Around the same time, another group of Vikings landed in northern Africa and fought the forces of the Caliph. They lost, but not before killing tens of thousands of Muslims. Between 853 and 866 AD, a Viking named Ragnar Lothbrok terrorized England. He was the king of Denmark and an infamous pillager when his band of warriors killed King Yella of Northumbria and threw his body into a pit. Not one to take this lying down, Ella's brother, the king of Mercia, assembled an army and chased Ragnar to his home. But Ragnar was prepared. He and his men ambushed the pursuing army and killed many of them. Then he did something very un-Viking, executed the captured kings by throwing them into a snake pit, like the ultimate boss in an 8-bit adventure game. But like I said, Vikings weren't just raiders, they were also traders. In fact, when they weren't busy plundering monasteries, they traded with the people of the regions they attacked. And when I say traded, I don't mean bartered. Vikings were shrewd businessmen. They knew how to get the best deal. In return for the goods they looted, they received payment in silver and gold. But with time, Viking raids became less frequent. Why? Because as they explored new lands, they found that trading was more lucrative than pillaging, and these guys were excellent sailors. In fact, they discovered and settled in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, where they established a settlement at Lonso Meadows, an archaeological site in Newfoundland, Canada. The Vikings also explored the eastern coast of North America in a land they named Vinland. So the next time you hear the word Viking, remember, they weren't just brutes, they were also traders and explorers. In fact, if not for the Vikings, who knows when Europe would have discovered America? For more adventures in history, subscribe to our channel. Alfred the Great is a legendary medieval warrior. But how did he become great? Let's find out. In the 9th century, England was not a united country. It was divided into several small kingdoms, which made it easy for the Vikings to raid. They came from Scandinavia in their longships, pillaging and burning monasteries on their way to the riches of the Frankish Empire. The English were prepared for battle, but they weren't prepared for the Viking onslaught. One kingdom in southern England called Wessex, however, was getting ready. Its king at the time was a man named Alfred. He took the throne when he was only 23 years old, after his father died, and his brother ceded the crown to him. Alfred's early reign was marked by war against the Vikings and against the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He was unsuccessful at first and lost a battle to a Viking force in 866. That defeat forced him to escape into the forest disguised as a hermit. And when the Vikings left, he had to hide in a marsh for weeks, until he was eventually found by his loyal followers. This humiliating episode stuck with him and spurred him on to do better. So Alfred set about building an elite military force. He established fortified towns and trained his men in defensive tactics, devising a shield wall that would become a staple of English military strategy. He also began a law code to ensure order in his realm, and he reached out to the Danes in an attempt to buy them off. In 878, all these efforts culminated in victory at the Battle of Edington. There, the English, led by Alfred, held out against the Vikings despite being outnumbered. When the smoke cleared, Alfred had won a decisive victory that established him as the dominant power in England. But Alfred didn't stop there. After defeating the Vikings, he spent the rest of his reign securing his gains and pushing the Vikings. Back across the North Sea, Alfred was known for his piety and promoted the building of churches across his kingdom. He also founded the first English navy to keep the Vikings from landing on his shores. Perhaps most importantly, though, he commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of histories written in the English language. Alfred wanted his people to know their history and be inspired by it. He translated many important texts into English so that his literate subjects could read about Roman law, Christian theology, and the classics. Alfred's efforts to promote education led to the construction of schools throughout the kingdom, and he was known to have tutored young nobles himself. Though he never had any children, Alfred ensured that his legacy would live on in the minds of his people and in the institutions he created. When Alfred died in 899, his son-in-law, Edward the Elder, succeeded him and continued his policies. Edward's son, Athelstan, would go on to unite all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under one banner and would be crowned the first King of England in 927, though he was a great warrior and a great administrator. Alfred's greatest quality may have been his patience. He understood that he could not defeat the Vikings in one battle, so he spent years preparing, training, and reaching out until he was ready. In the end, he won not just a battle, but the loyalty of his people and the respect of his enemies. Thanks for watching. To learn more about Alfred the Great and other medieval history topics, check out the series in the description below. Ah, the Vikings. Those ferocious warriors who pillaged and traded their way from the icy north to the warm south, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But strangely enough, in Eastern Europe, the Vikings played a different role. Here they were not feared as invaders, but welcomed as liberators. And it all started with one man, Rurik. Rurik was a Viking, though not in the usual sense. He wasn't a bloodthirsty pillager, but a shrewd politician. He understood the art of making alliances and forging a common culture out of thin air. At 862 AD, the Slavic tribes of Eastern Europe were tired of endless fighting with the Byzantine Empire and the Khazars. So they invited Rurik to come and rule over them, and so he did. Arriving in Novgorod with his two brothers, Cineas and Truvor, he established a new kingdom that would become the foundation of modern Russia. His dynasty, the Kievan Rus, would rule for the next 3 centuries. But wait, why did the Slavs invite the Vikings to rule over them? Well, there are a few theories. The Slavs might have been influenced by the Byzantine Empire, which often employed Vikings as mercenaries and had a long history of having close ties with the Varangians, as the Vikings were called in the Byzantine Empire. It's also possible that the Slavs simply wanted a strong leader to protect them from their enemies. Whatever the reason, they invited Rurik, and he obliged. Rurik's capital was in Novgorod, but soon his successor, Oleg, would make Kiev the new capital. Located at the crossroads of trade between the Vikings, the Byzantines, and the Slavs, Kiev soon became a powerful and wealthy city. Under Oleg's rule, the Vikings were fully integrated into the Slavic culture. Oleg himself married a Slavic princess, and many Vikings converted to Christianity after making pilgrimages to the Byzantine Empire. Now this is where things get interesting, because we tend to think of Vikings as ferocious pagans, who worshipped gods like Thor and Odin, and while that's true, there was more to their religion than just that. See, paganism wasn't a monolithic block. It was made up of many different beliefs and practices that often coexisted. In fact, some scholars argue that the Vikings weren't even particularly warlike, at least not in the modern sense. They didn't go around looking for fights. They mostly fought in self-defense, or when there was a chance to gain something valuable. Even their raids on Christian monasteries were often less about pillaging and more about obtaining the relics of saints, which were believed to have magical powers. In any case, Rurik and Oleg's introduction of a centralized state and a common culture was a boon for the Slavs. For the first time, they had a standing army that could defend them from external threats. They also had a system of laws and a council of nobles to help govern the state. In fact, the legal code of the Kievan Rus is considered to be one of the most progressive of its time, granting equal rights to all people regardless of social status. What about the Vikings who pillaged and traded in the Mediterranean? How did they square that circle? Well, it's important to remember that not all Vikings went on to become part of the Kievan Rus. Many of them continued to live as freewheeling traders and warriors. However, those who did settle down found that they could make more money through trade than through pillaging. After all, the Slavic lands were rich in furs, timber, and honey, all of which were in high demand in the Byzantine Empire. And so the Vikings became merchants. They also intermarried with the local population and adopted their customs. Over time, they became indistinguishable from the Slavs. The Kievan Rus lasted for over 300 years, but eventually it was absorbed into the growing Mongol Empire. Nevertheless, it left a lasting legacy. The capital of Kiev remains one of the most important cities in Ukraine, and the dynasty of Rurik continues to this day in the Romanov family. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just think of pillaging and plunder. Think of Rurik, the Viking who taught the Slavs the value of law and order. A man who showed them that even a fierce warrior can become a shrewd politician and a cunning diplomat. Thanks for watching. And thus ends our tale of the Silk Road. And how fitting an ending is this? A meeting of cultures, trade, and ideas at a crossroads of civilizations. And these crossroads were not just in Samarkand or Constantinople, they were also in Jerusalem, the holiest city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. So far, we have traced the beginnings of globalization. We have seen how merchants from China sailed across the oceans to do business in Africa. We have seen how Chinese silk ended up adorning the cathedrals of Europe, and how Buddhist monks carried the message of Lord Buddha to lands as distant as Poland and Greece. We have seen how ideas and inventions traveled along the routes of the Silk Road, how paper and gunpowder and the compass transformed the world. But now we must turn to the theater of war, where religion takes center stage. For our story would be incomplete without the Crusades. those epic battles between Christians and Muslims for control of the Holy Land. So from the serene poetry of Tang China to Charlemagne's crown in Rome, from Viking terror on Europe, ashores to the birth of England and Russia, all this unfolded within just a few centuries. But my Indian friends, this was only the warm-up act, because ahead lies one of history's most dramatic theaters, Jerusalem, the holy city of three faiths. Soon, popes will call crusades, knights will march, sultans will fight back, and East and West will collide in wars called the Crusades. But before that, let me tell you a little more about Jerusalem. For around 1,000 years before the Crusades, this city had been an important stop on the Silk Road. My merchant friends would tell you that Jerusalem was a great place for business. The roads leading here were lined with shops selling spices, carpets, ivory, wine, and all manner of fine goods. In fact, the very first European to travel to India, a man called Marco Polo, reached Jerusalem on his way to the Holy Land. He arrived in the year 1183 AD at that time. The ruler of Jerusalem was a man named Saladin. He was a Muslim, a Kurd by tribe and a warrior king, like the ones you read about in ancient Indian texts. He was known as Salah al-Din Yusuf, but his Indian name would have been Salah al-Din, which is why I call him Saladin. According to Muslim chronicles, when Saladin conquered Jerusalem, he found Marco Polo in the city. Apparently, the Venetian merchant was so impressed by the Muslim ruler that he gave Saladin a gift, a horse from Venice. Now, the chronicles say Saladin accepted the gift, but he did not use it. Instead, he sent the horse back to Marco Polo with a note. And this is what the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Khalikan wrote about Saladin's reply to Marco Polo. The Sultan sent back the horse saying, "I do not need your presence, nor anything of the kind. All I want is to serve the cause of Islam and to be an instrument of its spread." And that is exactly what Saladin did. When news of Saladin's victories reached Europe, the Christian leaders there got very worried. They were worried that Jerusalem might fall out of Christian hands forever. And so they decided to launch a crusade to capture the city. It was Pope Urban II who called for the First Crusade in the year 1095 AD at the time. Europe was suffering from economic depression, political instability, and widespread famine. And the Pope promised the common folk that if they went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, their sins would be forgiven. That's when the people of France, Germany, and Italy picked up their swords and headed eastwards. By the end of 1099 AD, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem. Since then, there has been no looking back. There were 8 crusades in all, and they lasted for nearly 200 years. Most of them failed, but the impact of the Crusades on Europe was immense. It gave rise to powerful states like England and Russia. It led to the exchange of ideas between East and West, and it laid the foundation of modern-day Turkey. But for now, let us stop here. Let us savor the moment, for the great game is now afoot. Its knights are ready. The battle lines are being drawn. It's going to be a long, hard fight for Jerusalem. Who will win it, the Christians or the Muslims? You'll find out in the next episode. Till then, goodbye. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade to take back control of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the Muslims. At the end of the 11th century, shocking news traveled across Europe. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the sacred site where Christians believed Jesus was crucified and resurrected, had been destroyed in 1009 by Caliph al-Hakim. Soon after, the Seljuk Turks seized the Holy Land and restricted pilgrimages. So in 1095, Pope Urban II raised his voice. Whoever liberates Jerusalem shall be forgiven of all sins. To the medieval Christian, this was the ultimate lifetime offer. Nobles, knights, even poor peasants signed up. Thus began the First Crusade, which would change the course of history. But why? Why did the Pope call for this holy war? What were the consequences of that call? Let's find out. In the late 11th century, Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land faced great danger. In 1071, the Battle of Manzikert saw the Byzantine army decisively defeated by the Seljuks, who then seized much of Anatolia. As a result, the road to Jerusalem was now controlled by the Turks. Though technically still a part of the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuks were de facto in charge. They allowed Christian pilgrims to pass only through certain checkpoints, subjecting them to intense scrutiny and abuse. And if that wasn't bad enough, in 1080, the new Muslim ruler of Jerusalem, Alafd el-Shahanshah, closed off access to the city entirely. Pope Gregory VII excommunicated him and called for a crusade, but nothing came of it. However, in 1092, after a bishop was beaten to death on pilgrimage, Pope Urban II decided enough was enough. He wanted Jerusalem back in Christian hands, and he promised God's forgiveness to anyone willing to help. The response was overwhelming. Within months of the call to crusade, nobles and knights from all over Europe pledged their support. Some were motivated by religion. For others, the promise of land and riches in the Holy Land was too good to pass up. Even poor peasants joined, hoping for an easy life under the rule of the Church. As soon as the spring of 1096 arrived, the Crusaders began their march east. There were thousands of them, perhaps even tens of thousands, but they weren't an army. There was no system of ranks or chain of command. The Crusaders were divided into groups of 30 men each led by a local lord. Discipline was lacking and supplies were low. Meanwhile, word of the approaching Crusaders reached the ears of Alexios Komnenos, the ruler of the Byzantine Empire. He desperately needed help against the Seljuks, but these ragtag European warriors weren't what he had in mind. Still, seeing as how he didn't have a better option, he struck a deal with the leaders of the Crusader states. They would assist the Byzantines in exchange for safe passage through their territory. But this proved to be a bad decision, for as soon as the Crusaders entered Anatolia, they began pillaging. Villages were attacked, churches robbed, and the Byzantines got dragged into the mess. Seeing this, Alexios changed his mind and ordered the Crusaders to leave, but it was too late. The damage was done. Internal strife tore the group apart, and outside threats were growing. The Seljuks were massing an army to crush the invaders. Undeterred, the Crusaders pushed on. But their goal was not Jerusalem. It was Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. After a long siege, the city fell in June of 1097. The Crusaders had won their first major victory, but at what cost? Thousands had died of starvation and disease. Those who survived were exhausted and demoralized. Still, 2 more years of campaigning lay ahead, and so we'll continue the story in part 2. What challenges did the Crusaders face on their way to Jerusalem? How did they overcome them? And what impact did the Crusades have on the medieval world? I'd find out in the next episode. Millions of people around the world are discovering the Crusades through our videos, and you can be among them. Watch the next episode on our channel. Did you like this video? Then check out these other videos. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to be notified of new releases. Thanks for watching. Why do Christians celebrate Christmas in December? In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before an assembly of European nobles and bishops, and he told them that Christians needed to conquer the Holy Land. This speech would be known as the Clermont Speech, and it's considered to be the official start of the Crusades, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We will look at the First Crusade, which resulted in the conquest of Jerusalem and the creation of several Crusader states in the Middle East. As always, if you want to get more details about anything mentioned in this episode, check the description below. Let's go back to the year 1095. At that time, Western Europe was politically fragmented with hundreds of independent states ruled by kings, dukes, counts, and lords. While Eastern Europe was dominated by the Byzantine Empire, that was the second largest medieval state in Europe. However, despite being ruled by different emperors, all these people spoke the same language. They followed the same religion, and they considered themselves to be part of the same Christian community. At the same time, to the east of the Byzantine Empire, there was the Muslim world, also fragmented into many independent states. The most powerful one at the time was the Seljuk Empire, a nomadic Central Asian tribe that had conquered large parts of Western Asia, including the Levant region, which contains modern-day Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. As the Seljuks moved westward, they encountered the Byzantines and other Christian rulers, and there were some conflicts between them. For example, in 1071, the Seljuks defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and that led to the occupation of Anatolia by Muslim Turks. So at that point, The Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos asked European Christians to help him take back Anatolia from the Muslims. However, while the Byzantines were writing letters asking for help, Pope Urban II had a much bigger plan in mind. He wanted to take the Holy Land from the Muslims, and he saw the request for help from the Byzantines as a great opportunity to do that. So when Urban called for a crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095, he didn't mention the Byzantines or the Turks or Anatolia. He only talked about the Muslims of the Middle East and how evil they were and how European Christians needed to fight against them and win the Holy Land back for God. His speech may have been exaggerated and manipulative, but it worked like a charm. Thousands of European men picked up their weapons and started marching east to fight the Muslims. They were poor and had no organization. They were constantly hungry and often quarreling with each other. Yet luck was on their side. The Muslim world was divided. The Seljuks didn't know about the coming storm in the west. And that's why by 1098, the Crusader army seized Edessa, a city in Mesopotamia. And then in 1099, they besieged Jerusalem. It was the most important city in the Middle East. And if they could capture it, then it would be a great propaganda victory for the Europeans. But the problem was that it was very well defended. It had high walls and enough food to last for months. So the Crusaders had to resort to siege warfare. That means attacking the city at night, trying to breach its walls and shooting arrows and catapults over the walls to kill as many defenders as possible. This continued for 8 months until July 15th, when the Crusaders finally captured the city. It was a bloody conquest. The Crusaders killed everyone inside the city: Muslim, Jewish, Christian. Only women, children, and prisoners of war were spared, and even they were sold into slavery. In total, there were 4 major crusades in the Middle East: the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, and the Fourth Crusade. Today we'll focus on the first 2. As I said, the First Crusade ended with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. But it was uneasy for the Crusaders to hold on to their prize. Soon after they arrived, internal divisions began to appear. There were 3 main groups: the French, the Germans, and the Italians, and they disagreed over who should be in charge. There was also disagreement over what to do with the prisoners taken from Jerusalem. Some wanted to kill them, others wanted to enslave them, and still others wanted to convert them to Christianity and free them. Those disagreements eventually led to the establishment of several Crusader states in the Levant, a Latin patriarchate in Jerusalem, counties in Tripoli and Edessa, and a kingdom in Jerusalem. This meant that instead of going back home after conquering Jerusalem, many Crusaders chose to stay in the Middle East and settle down there. And that turned out to be a mistake, because the Muslim world was as divided as the Crusaders thought it was. In 1144, the Muslim general Zengi recaptured Edessa. That was a disaster. The Crusaders lost a valuable ally and a buffer state between them and the rest of the Muslim world. The Europeans were furious and they wanted revenge. This, coupled with the fact that many European Christians felt guilty for not participating in the First Crusade, led to the start of the Second Crusade. That was between 1147 and 1149. Again, it was started by Pope Eugene III, who encouraged the kings of France, Louis VII, and Germany, Conrad III, to lead the crusade. But those two couldn't cooperate. Louis left France in 1146 and headed east. Conrad was supposed to meet up with him 2 years later, but Conrad got distracted by rebellions at home. And he didn't join the crusade until a year after Louis had already invaded the Middle East. And by then, the French had suffered a series of defeats and were in no condition to help anyone. Louis marched his army through the Byzantine Empire and hoped to receive supplies from Alexios Komnenos, just like the Crusaders did during the First Crusade. But things had changed since then. The relationship between European Christians and the Byzantines had deteriorated, and Alexios refused to help. On top of that, the French didn't have enough supplies for their soldiers, and eventually they had to abandon their siege of Lisbon and retreat to France. Conrad fared no better. His army was decimated by starvation and disease, and he died soon after returning to Germany. So the Second Crusade was nothing but a fiasco. It's important to remember that although the Crusades are mainly remembered for their religious zeal, they weren't purely religious expeditions. Religion was used as a tool to achieve political goals. In both cases, the Crusaders had help from the Pope and the support of European nobility. In fact, it was the nobles who benefited the most from the Crusades. For example, Louis VII, who led the Second Crusade, gained a lot of land in France as a reward for his participation. And Godfrey of Bouillon, who captured Jerusalem in 1099, became the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and his brothers and cousins received titles to various territories in the Middle East. Of course, all of this came at a terrible cost in human lives. But as far as the European nobility was concerned, the benefits outweighed the costs. So when the Third Crusade rolled around in 1189, they sent King Richard the Lionheart to lead the European forces. The Third Crusade was sparked by the conquest of Jerusalem by Saladin, a Muslim general who united most of the Middle East under the banner of the Ayyubid dynasty. Despite the efforts of Richard and his allies, the crusade failed to recapture Jerusalem. And in 1192 they signed a treaty with Saladin, which granted European Christians access to the city as pilgrims. The Fourth Crusade was between 1202 and 1204, and it resulted in the sack of Zara, a Christian city, and then the sack of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It's considered to be the biggest failure in the history of crusades. So the takeaway here is that, although the Crusades had some religious motivations, they were mostly political expeditions aimed at expanding the power and influence of European kingdoms and getting control of trade routes to the east. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you Pedro, Goncalo, Tiago, Miguel, and Rafael for your support. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe. Bye. While blood was shed in the Holy Land, far away in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire built something entirely different. In 1150, King Suryavarman II commissioned the construction of a great temple to the god Vishnu. The complex would eventually be called Angkor Wat, which means Temple City. Finished around 1200, it was a vast structure surrounded by a grand moat. Covered with carvings from the Mahabharata and Ramayana, it was less a temple and more a stone universe, an earthly paradise that made pilgrims feel they had died and gone to heaven. Back in the Middle East, a new hero rose. His name was Saladin, Sultan of Egypt. By 1187, he had united Muslim forces and declared a jihad to retake Jerusalem. At the Battle of Hattin, his cavalry surrounded the Crusaders, crushing them. Soon after, Jerusalem fell back to Islam. Europe was shocked to its core. But let's go back to 1150, when construction began on the temple complex. Across the 12th century, the Khmer kings built huge temples to the Hindu gods, but none so grand as Angkor Wat. It took 30,000 workers 30 years to complete. The result was a sprawling structure about 4 miles around with 5 towers that symbolized Mount Meru, the center of the world in Hindu cosmology. Each tower symbolized a different level of the heavens. The central one rose 200 feet into the air. The temple complex was designed to recreate the cosmic order. A wide moat, 100 feet wide and 3 miles around, served as a protective barrier, like the ocean that surrounded the known world. Next came the outer wall, adorned with scenes from the Hindu epics. Then came the jungle, a dense forest that concealed the towers of Angkor Thom, the capital of the Khmer Empire. And at the center of it all stood Angkor Wat. To get there, visitors walked along a causeway that passed through the first of 3 enormous gates, each one decorated with mythical creatures called chakras. These guarded the entrance to the next level of the earthly paradise. Here the air grew cooler and flowers more fragrant. Pedestals and pillars carved with intricate designs supported the weight of the upper stories. Stairways spiraled around them. The deeper one went into the complex, the more peaceful the atmosphere became. The sounds of the outside world were muffled by the thick walls. Finally, the visitor reached the top of the central tower, the highest point in the city. From here, one could see for miles in every direction. The view was so breathtaking that it felt like a vision from heaven. But the experience didn't end there. The temple's many towers, walls, and gates were covered with carvings depicting stories from ancient Indian epics. There were scenes from the Mahabharata and Ramayana, depictions of gods and demons doing battle with one another. The most famous is the churning of the Sea of Milk, when the gods and demons churned up the sea to find the elixir of immortality. The churning produced many wondrous things, including the goddess of wisdom. She is shown here riding a giant fish, one of several auspicious symbols found throughout the complex. The churning also produced a venomous snake, a symbol of danger. The demon king Bali tries to claim the elixir, but the gods prevent him from doing so. The god Vishnu intervenes to restore the cosmic order. The churning of the sea of milk is just one of many stories depicted on the temple walls. Together, they form a kind of encyclopedia of the Hindu religion. The carvings are so numerous and detailed that it's taken scholars nearly a century to identify them all. Some parts of the complex still haven't been fully explored. Angkor Wat was built during the golden age of the Khmer Empire, when the king's power was at its height. But the empire would eventually decline, and Angkor Wat was abandoned. The jungle took over, and the temple was lost to the world until it was rediscovered by Western explorers in the 19th century. Today it's the biggest religious monument in the world and one of the new 7 wonders of the world. The ancient Khmer believed that Angkor Wat was a stairway to heaven. Looking at the carvings on the walls, it's easy to see why. By 1187, the year that Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, the Khmer king Jayavarman VII was nearing the end of his reign. He had built several smaller temples, but nothing as grand as Angkor Wat. When his successor, Suryavarman II, took the throne, he set about remedying that. The new king embarked on a building project that would last for decades and cover hundreds of square miles. The centerpiece was to be a huge temple complex dedicated to Vishnu, the Preserver, one of the chief gods in the Hindu pantheon. The construction of Angkor Wat may have been inspired by a pilgrimage that Suryavarman took to India. There he visited the great temple city of Haryana, which had been built 2 centuries earlier. Haryana was carved out of a single rock, whereas Angkor Wat was built with individual stones. But the two complexes share many similarities, especially in their layout. Both are built on a raised platform with a moat around them. Both feature towers that symbolize Mount Meru, the center of the cosmos in Hindu mythology. Like other Khmer kings, Suryavarman saw himself as a god on earth. His capital, Angkor Thom, was laid out according to the sacred texts. The rectangular city was divided into 9 parts, representing the grid of mountains and rivers that encircles the Sea of Milk in Hindu mythology. The city was also oriented according to the 4 directions. Its 4 gates were positioned to line up with the cardinal points of the compass. Even the roads that radiated outward from the city were designed to follow the flow of cosmic energy. All of these features were meant to bring the king and his subjects closer to the divine. The elaborate architecture created a sense of awe and wonder. The many towers, gables, and statues created a visual feast. The intricately carved walls told stories of gods and heroes. Visitors could wander through the complex for hours and always find something new to marvel at. What makes Angkor Wat even more remarkable is that it was built in the middle of the jungle. The ancient Khmer knew how to harness the power of nature. They built dams to create artificial lakes and reservoirs. They constructed canals to distribute water throughout the city. They planted trees and flowers to provide food and shade. In many ways, Angkor Wat was the perfect city. It was a place where the king and his subjects could live in harmony with each other and with the natural world. It was a true earthly paradise. When the call to arms was sounded, Europe responded with its superstar team: Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, Richard the Lionheart, King of England, and Philip II, King of France. Together, they led an army of 30,000 men eastwards to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims. Barbarossa, a giant of a man, was the leader of the team. He had already conquered most of northern Italy and was eager for more. Richard, the second most powerful man on the team, wasn't interested in Barbarossa's plans for a united Italy. He was only there because his father, King Henry II, had been excommunicated by the Pope for getting a bit too heavy-handed with his authority, and young Richard hoped that by conquering the Holy Land, he could win back the Pope's favor and his own kingdom's reputation. Philip, meanwhile, had his own reasons for wanting to go to war. He wanted to distract from the fact that back home his wife was having an affair with one of his knights, and so the 3 amigos rode off to fight the Muslims, each for their own personal gain. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Frederick's army marched across the mountains into Asia Minor, he took a tumble in a river and drowned. With their leader dead, the Germans turned around and headed back home. Richard and Philip, however, were determined to press on. though the two kings couldn't do anything together because they hated each other. They'd fought over who should lead the army at the siege of Acre, and ever since, Philip had been waiting for a chance to stick it to Richard. When Frederick drowned, that chance came. Philip declared that since Richard was now the most senior leader, he should take over the siege, but Richard refused. He said that he didn't trust Philip and that he would rather do it his own way. Philip got the message and packed up and headed back to France. Richard was left with about 10,000 soldiers, including some elite troops from his kingdom, as well as those loyal to him from the German and French armies. With the rest of the European leaders gone, Richard realized he couldn't take Jerusalem without help. So he called on the one person he least wanted to see, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Saladin had led the Muslims to victory at the siege of Acre, and was now camped outside the city with 40,000 men. Richard, knowing he was outnumbered, was terrified. He'd heard stories of Saladin's prowess as a warrior and as a leader. His knights had told tales of how the Sultan's army had overwhelmed them at sea, and Richard knew that if he lost this battle, he would never get back to England. The two armies clashed outside the city walls. Richard's knights charged into the fray, but they soon found themselves surrounded. One by one, the English fell to the swords of the Egyptian and Syrian soldiers. As the tide of the battle turned against him, Richard took off, fleeing deep into enemy territory. For 5 days he rode, always looking over his shoulder, expecting to hear the pounding of hooves behind him. But Saladin did not pursue him. The Sultan had given his word that he would not harm the king, and he was a man who kept his promises. After 5 days of riding, Richard came across a small castle. Inside, he learned that the castle belonged to a Muslim lord named Balian. Balian, a former Crusader knight, had converted to Islam after being captured by Saladin. He invited Richard to stay in his castle, but when the Sultan's army arrived, he advised Richard to flee again. Richard eventually made his way to the coast, where a small boat was waiting to take him back to England. Once there, he made sure everyone knew that he hadn't lost the battle. He'd simply chosen to save his men from certain death, while his knights were happy to hear that everyone knew the truth. Richard had run away. Meanwhile, Saladin had retaken Jerusalem. But although neither side had emerged victorious, both leaders had achieved something neither had expected. Richard had managed to escape with his life, and Saladin had proven himself to be honorable. In 1192, Richard and Saladin met again. This time, it was on neutral ground. They met and talked for hours about their meeting. They decided to end the fighting and sign a treaty. The city would remain under Muslim rule, but Christian pilgrims could visit safely. Richard rode back to England a changed man. His crusade had failed, but he had gained something far greater, a new perspective on the world and his place in it. Saladin, meanwhile, continued to expand his empire. But despite his many victories, he was haunted by the memory of Richard the Lionheart. And that is why. Why did the Crusades fail? For over 100 years, European Christians tried and failed to capture Jerusalem. So why don't we just make a list of all the times they failed? No. It's not how this works. There are multiple reasons why the Crusades failed, and each crusade had its own unique circumstances. But by the end of the 12th century, there were two main reasons for the failure of the Crusades. Let's talk about those. Okay, reason no. 1. After the First Crusade, it became less about faith and more about politics and trade. I mean, sure, the Christian rulers of Europe used religion to justify their desire to conquer Jerusalem. But their goals went beyond just creating a pilgrimage route. They wanted political and economic power. For example, after the First Crusade, European states began establishing trading posts throughout the Middle East, and they wanted to expand their influence in the region. And while the Pope still called for the Crusades as holy missions, many European nobles saw them as an opportunity to acquire wealth and land. Now, you might say, well, that's kind of cheating. You know, the whole point was to take Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. That is true. But European Christians weren't the only ones making pilgrimages in the Middle Ages. A lot of Muslims and Jews traveled to the Holy Land too. And these groups faced discrimination and violence from European Christians, especially when those Christians started to see the area as economically valuable. For example, when the Republic of Venice seized the coastal city of Zara in 1204, they took control of a major pilgrimage route that Muslims used to get to Mecca. So now these European Christians are making pilgrimages, but other people can't make their pilgrimages. This tension between European Christians and other religious groups will become a major factor in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. But more on that later, right? Reason no, too. European Christians couldn't even agree on what to do, much less actually do it. After the First Crusade, Europeans launched 7 more major crusades to the Holy Land, and none of them succeeded in taking Jerusalem. And that's right, 7 more crusades. I said major. We're not counting the minor ones here. But I mean, what were they thinking would happen? The Second through the Fourth Crusades all failed because European Christians couldn't agree on where to go or who to fight. Like I mentioned earlier, after the First Crusade, European states began eyeing the riches of the Byzantine Empire, not realizing that Byzantium was a Christian empire. And so, when Pope Innocent III called for the Fourth Crusade to take Jerusalem, the German king and the French king got into a massive disagreement over whether to attack Byzantium or not, and that's bad. When your pope, your king, and your cardinal are all arguing with each other, you're probably not going to have a very successful crusade. And ultimately, the Fourth Crusade ended up sacking Constantinople. Oops. I mean, to be fair, sacking another Christian city wasn't exactly what Pope Innocent had in mind when he called for the crusade. But that's what happens when your army is full of German, French, and Venetian soldiers. They don't really listen to the Pope. The next 3 crusades were led by King Louis IX of France, better known as St. Louis. Yeah, that's right. He is a saint. And Louis wanted to recapture Jerusalem, but he picked the worst possible place to try to launch his crusades. The first of these crusades was in 1228, and Louis marched right into Egypt. Okay. I guess Egypt isn't that far from Jerusalem, but geographically speaking, it's like going to the United Kingdom to try to take Canada. Louis didn't even make it to Jerusalem before turning around and going home because he got, I don't even want to say it, he got scared. His second crusade started off better, but ended in the same way. After meeting with Muslim leaders in 1239, Louis got scared again. On his third attempt in 1248, Louis actually made it to Tunis, but he got sick and died on the way back to France. So not only did the last 3 crusades fail to take Jerusalem, they also failed to take anything else. I mean, at least Louis IX tried to take Jerusalem. Other European leaders weren't even trying anymore. For example, when Pope Gregory VIII called for the 7th Crusade in 1254, the King of England said, "No thanks, I'm busy getting divorced." And the King of France said, "No thanks, I'm busy having an affair." And the Holy Roman Emperor said, "No thanks, I'm busy murdering 60,000 people in a single day." Now, maybe I'm being a little unfair. There was one European leader who answered the call for the 7th Crusade, but he didn't have any troops to lead, so he sent a sheep. Maybe next time. So the Crusades evolved from being a religious mission to being a political and economic opportunity, which undermined their original purpose. Leaders began taking advantage of the common people who had initially come together under the banner of God. European Christians fought against each other, against Muslims, and against Jews. And by the end of the 12th century, people realized that conquering Jerusalem was nearly impossible and wouldn't even bring them closer to God. It was just a big waste of time and money, and that's why the Crusades failed. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Crusades. If you did, check out this playlist for more videos like this. If you want to learn more about medieval mishaps, including more about the sack of Constantinople, please consider supporting us. Thanks for watching.